This isn't about anyone else, this is actually about me in the grave.
I hadn't thought about how you needed to prepare or think about what needs to happen at the end stage.
Most of us haven't got time perhaps to think about these things.
As a culture, we don't know what death looks like, and we're so removed from it in terms of the medicalisation of it, that anything that encourages us to engage more with the dead is really powerful, powerful for the future lives of those who continue living after a death. We look at garments of the grave and paper garments of the grave in twofold. One is the aftermath, and one is the making and the processing that comes along with it. And I hope that it gives the artists courage to be more confronted by death, to accept that as an invitation into something that's quite a potent and powerful experience in their life. It can stem from such a simple idea and question of, well, what would you wear what would you wear for your burial? What would you wear for your death?
My father had a dog. He promised Mum before she died that he would get a dog as company. And sadly, when my dad died, we inherited the dog, and that dog was actually with my father when he passed away. So that's why I'm happy to use the tea bags, because the dog and Dad sat at that kitchen table and drank loads and loads of tea. Dad drank the tea and the dog watched every movement he made. The work also contains TAB stubs, the little betting slips. And it's not so much the betting that was important, it was the outing that the dog and my father did together. It was that journey, every week off they'd go. The paper itself and the way it disintegrates and goes back into the earth was really important.
My piece is attempting in some way to ask the question about where do we go when we die, but also to celebrate the fact that we have lived. So the piece is about the celebration of life and also the then celebration, hopefully, of a life afterwards, be that whatever it's labelled in whatever spiritual belief system you may or may not have. Very much presented something that is very taboo in our society in a way that makes it not conversational, but within the realms of discussion.
Knitting really was a first love, knitting and crocheting. And then when I actually started to make it, I felt very confronted because I decided to make a shroud for myself. So it was a very confronting issue. I've given a lot of thought to how I want to be buried, a lot of thought. And I've changed from sort of cremation to burial all through this last 6 months. But I'm now in a place where I'm not sure whether to leave instructions to the children on how I'm to be buried, or I leave it to them, because after all, I'm not going to be there. And I think funerals are for the people that are left behind.
My grandson Cody was stillborn, a week overdue, and shouldn't have been. So that has been a really big tragedy for our family. So there was never any question that I was going to do a garment around that story and my individual experience. One of the things that's really poignant about stillborn children is that their funeral service is usually their christening service as well, because they're never alive to actually have a christening or a baptism or some sort of formal recognition into the world. So that often happens at the funeral service, and it certainly did at my grandson's funeral, that we started a naming ceremony and then proceeded to the farewell. So I wanted to combine that idea of welcome and goodbye into the one. So I've used the traditional form of a christening gown with a lot of the embroidery techniques and worked with adaptations in the garment that would be appropriate for dressing the dead.
I'd already thought about natural burial. I wanted to be buried with a tree. I talked about this with my partner. Buried and have a tree grow on top of me and create a sacred forest. When I wrote the statement that was my expression of interest, I ended up writing out what would have been something like a will. And then I realised I hadn't written an expression of interest, but what I had done was begin to form the fetal figures that come out of the ground or return to the ground. I'm now equipped with knowledge about what might happen, and I also know who to talk to.
Usually when I create a piece, I think of it as giving birth to an idea, and then I create my piece and I'm nurturing my baby, and then when I'm finished, ready for an exhibition, then it's almost a birthing process, which is quite painful, and then it's ready to go on and have its life. The baby I'd given birth to, my idea was a dead baby, and I think that just compounded how emotional I felt. The idea of paper really taps into that natural burial that people are becoming really interested in. And I thought to really extend that would be to sew it with silk thread. And probably about halfway through, I thought, what have I done? Why have I done this to myself with all of these circles and all of these threads, and then meant to represent scale armour? And that's a mother's way of protecting her baby. And the threads are very fragile, the paper is very fragile, or all of the things that, life is.
My initial idea was to work on the theory of an imaginary aunt or a lady who was always a mentor for younger ones, or a mentor or a friend who would always be there with a cup of tea, cup of coffee, sit down and chat and just to talk over everyone's problems. When I analysed what I had done, I realised I had made a two-piece suit. I had painted coffee cups and plates and saucers, and I had done that as an image onto a garment. So that was quite profound for me, because I realised that I had some areas in my life that I hadn't quite reconciled.
I think at the heart of it is the fact that it's actually decay. What we are disappears. It's not necessarily easy, it can be very messy. I wanted to get across the idea of the trees, the rebirth. And so I settled on doing the stencils, and of course I'd never done printing or stencils before in my life. Because I've not been well, it has certainly given me something to focus on. It's given me a goal. It's given me something that matters. It's allowed me to rediscover that the artistic creative piece of me that was so intense when I was a teenager and young adult.
Why do we only use eulogy to someone who's died, and why not speak of them while they're still alive? And one morning I decided to write a eulogy about my grandfather. I've never really spoke about my grandfather in a good light. Now, knowing the word eulogy, meaning to speak well of someone, it changed me. And this was the healing part, the healing process for me. Because I believe if you speak well of someone, you yourself will also be changed. And so I spent a whole morning writing about my grandfather, thinking about all the good things he did, and just write about that.
While pain is painful, pain is just pain. It's how we react to it that makes the difference. And so perhaps we could say the same about death. It's how we react to it, and as we approach it, how we react to it again. The piece I have come up with is based around the concept of our body being temporal. There's really no difference between living well and dying well, because it's all one and the same thing. What we do today is important, what we do now, living in the present. Life is very, very challenging and painful sometimes, and there's no cure for that.
For me, it's the conversation that's almost more important, and the education around death that's more important than the objects themselves. And I think that's just an amazing gift to be able to give to their communities and their families, because it is so important and it is something that we don't talk about. I think that a lot of the artists have been engaged in the notion of natural burial, because it's one of the things that I talk about, and they've started a movement of their own by saying, well, what I want for my death isn't being addressed yet. And so they become the advocates for those movements.
I would imagine that thing about, both accepting but fighting against death, I think that's pretty human, probably.
The more information we have, the better we are prepared for the inevitable.
So when it is time for someone to die, that they have some information that's brought to them other than through a funeral director.
Grief doesn't go away, grief doesn't get less in tragic circumstances, or these sort of myths we have about, time heals and things pass and you move on. In fact, you don't. Those things come with you. What does happen is it becomes a normal part of the matrix of who you are.
I don't think I mind how I go. I don't mind how I'm buried. I don't, it doesn't worry me.
Any conversation that makes you live your life better, even if that means that you accept that you will die, to me that's really living. I'm really bad to have in a room, because I just start talking about death and dying, and I say quite probably inappropriate things because I feel very comfortable with it. Not comfortable that I actually will die and leave this world, but comfortable knowing I can't actually avoid that. So I've let that go. Could be today, could be tomorrow, could be in 50 years, but now I can just get on with life. I feel free, I feel liberated. I think it's great.